In 1968, Johnny Cash walked into Folsom Prison surrounded by murderers, rapists, and hardened criminals. Guards warned him he might not walk out alive. What happened next changed music history forever, but the dark truth behind these legendary concerts has been buried for decades. Cash wasn't just performing for prisoners, he was nearly one of them. This is the untold story of how the man in black risked everything to stand with the forgotten men society had thrown away. To understand why Johnny Cash felt such a deep connection to the men of Folsom and San Quentin, we need to look at his own troubled history with the law. The man in black wasn't just singing about prison life, he was dangerously close to experiencing it firsthand. By the mid-1960s, Cash was spiraling out of control. His addiction to amphetamines and barbiturates had taken over his life, leading to erratic behavior that repeatedly put him in handcuffs. In 1965, he was arrested in El Paso after customs agents found over 1,000 prescription pills hidden in his guitar case. This wasn't a small offense. He was facing potential felony drug charges that could have sent him to prison for years. Cash's daughter, Roseanne, later revealed just how close her father came to serving serious time. He was looking at 7 to 10 years. He had a serious drug problem, and he was in real danger of going to prison for a long time. But this wasn't his only brush with the law. In 1965, Cash was arrested in Starkville, Mississippi for trespassing on private property to pick flowers after a show. He spent the night in jail, an experience that later inspired his song, Starkville City Jail. In 1966, his car caught fire in Los Padres National Forest, burning over 500 acres of land. When questioned by a judge about starting the fire, Cash famously replied, "No, sir, my truck did, and it's dead, so you can't question it." These weren't just colorful stories for his outlaw image. They were warning signs of how close Cash was to losing everything. His friend Waylon Jennings later said, "John walked a razor's edge. There were times when I honestly didn't know if he'd live to see the next day." Cash's most dangerous period came in October 1967, just months before the Folsom concert. Completely disoriented from drugs, he crawled into Nickajack Cave in Tennessee, intending to die in the darkness. He later described having a spiritual awakening in that cave, which began his journey towards sobriety. When Cash looked into the faces of the men at Folsom and San Quentin, he wasn't seeing criminals. He was seeing reflections of himself and what could have been. He understood the thin line between freedom and incarceration, between redemption and ruin. "I knew what it was like to be behind bars," Cash later wrote in his autobiography. "I'd been behind bars a few times myself, though never for long. I knew what it was like to have that door close behind you, to be cut off from the rest of the world." This personal connection gave Cash's prison performances an authenticity that resonated deeply with the inmates. But getting those concerts to happen required fighting against a system that wanted to silence both Cash and the prisoners he came to support. When Johnny Cash first proposed performing at Folsom Prison, he faced immediate resistance. Prison officials were skeptical, record executives were nervous, and even some of Cash's own team questioned the wisdom of putting a drug-addicted, unstable performer inside one of America's most notorious maximum security prisons. What few people realize is that Cash had been trying to perform at Folsom for nearly a decade. He first reached out to the prison in 1959 after recording Folsom Prison Blues, but various obstacles kept delaying the concert. By the time it finally happened in 1968, Cash was at one of the lowest points of his career, struggling with addiction, watching his record sales decline, and desperately needing something to revitalize his music. The days leading up to the Folsom concert revealed just how dangerous the situation was. Cash arrived at the prison the night before, staying at a nearby motel where he battled insomnia and the temptation of drugs. His longtime friend and guitarist Luther Perkins later recalled, "John was shaking so bad that morning, I wasn't sure he could hold a guitar pick." When Cash and his entourage arrived at the prison gates, they were given a stark warning by Warden Walter Craven. "Remember, if there is a riot or any trouble, you'll be the first hostages." The prison had prepared for potential violence, stationing armed guards in towers overlooking the cafeteria where Cash would perform. What made the situation even more tense was the prison administration's attempt to censor Cash's performance. Officials handed him a list of songs he couldn't perform, anything they felt might incite the prisoners or glorify prison life. Cash took the list, nodded politely, and then completely ignored it once he got on stage. The recording of At Folsom Prison was heavily edited to remove some of the most revealing moments. What listeners don't hear are Cash's provocative comments between songs, the guards nervously fingering their weapons when the inmates got too rowdy, or the raw tension that filled the room when Cash performed Greystone Chapel, a song written by inmate Glenn Shirley, who was sitting in the front row. Cash's producer, Bob Johnston, later revealed how close they came to disaster. The warden kept trying to stop us. He'd say, "You can't say that," and I'd say, "Roll the tape." There were moments when I thought they might shut the whole thing down. The danger wasn't just from the prison administration. Cash was performing for men with nothing to lose. Murderers, armed robbers, and violent offenders who could have erupted at any moment. Yet instead of fear, Cash showed them respect. When he sang Folsom Prison Blues and reached the line, "I shot a man in Reno just to watch him die," the cafeteria erupted in cheers so loud that the recording had to be edited. But if Folsom was dangerous, what awaited Cash at San Quentin would push him even closer to the edge. If Folsom Prison tested Johnny Cash's resolve, San Quentin nearly broke it. On February 24, 1969, just over a year after his Folsom triumph, Cash walked into California's oldest and most notorious prison, a facility known for housing some of America's most dangerous criminals, including Charles Manson and Sirhan Sirhan. What made San Quentin particularly volatile was its history of violence. In the months before Cash's arrival, tensions between inmates and guards had reached a boiling point. There had been multiple stabbings, and prison officials were struggling to maintain control. Cash was walking into a powder keg. San Quentin was different from Folsom, recalled Marshall Grant, Cash's bassist. "You could feel it the moment we walked in. The air was thick with hostility. These weren't just men who had made mistakes. These were men who had nothing to lose." The danger became immediately apparent during rehearsals when a prisoner approached Cash with a message. "There's talk among some of the inmates about taking hostages during your show." Rather than canceling, Cash simply nodded and continued preparing. His wife, June Carter, was visibly terrified, later admitting she thought they might not leave alive. During the performance, Cash deliberately pushed boundaries further than he had at Folsom. When prison officials told him not to mention prison conditions, he did exactly that, telling the inmates, "San Quentin, I hate every inch of you." The line, repeated 3 times with increasing intensity, nearly caused a riot as prisoners stomped, cheered, and rattled whatever they could find. It was during this charged atmosphere that Cash delivered one of music's most iconic acts of rebellion. When a prison photographer asked him to pose for publicity photos, Cash, frustrated with the constant surveillance and restrictions, raised his middle finger directly into the camera lens. The resulting image became a symbol of Cash's defiance against authority and his solidarity with the prisoners. What few people know is that after the main performance, Cash agreed to meet privately with a group of the most dangerous inmates in solitary confinement, men considered too volatile to attend the main concert. Armed only with his guitar and accompanied by a single guard, Cash performed for men who hadn't seen entertainment in years. One of those inmates later wrote that it was the first time anyone treated us like we were still human. The San Quentin concert produced another hit album, but it also marked a turning point in Cash's activism. He had now seen firsthand the conditions in America's 2 most notorious prisons, and what he witnessed haunted him. He began speaking openly about prison reform in interviews, using his platform to criticize a system he believed was more focused on punishment than rehabilitation. But Cash's connection to these prisoners went beyond performances. He formed relationships with several inmates whose stories would profoundly impact his music and his mission. Behind Johnny Cash's prison concerts lie stories of real inmates whose lives became intertwined with the man in black. None more significant than Glenn Shirley, the inmate who wrote Greystone Chapel, the closing song on the Folsom Prison album. The night before the Folsom concert, a pastor who worked at the prison handed Cash a tape recording of Shirley performing his original song about finding faith in the prison chapel. Cash was so moved that he stayed up all night learning it. Without telling Shirley, Cash performed the song the next day, pointing to the stunned inmate in the front row and saying, "This song was written by Glenn Shirley, who's serving time here at Folsom." The moment changed Shirley's life forever. Cash later advocated for his parole, helped him secure a record deal, and even invited him to live on his property after his release. It was a remarkable act of faith in a man society had discarded, but the story ultimately ended in tragedy. Shirley struggled with freedom, battled addiction, and eventually took his own life in 1978, a painful reminder of the challenges faced by those trying to reintegrate after incarceration. Another inmate who deeply affected Cash was Merle Haggard, who wasn't at Folsom or San Quentin during Cash's recorded performances, but had been an inmate at San Quentin in 1958 when Cash first performed there. Haggard later recalled, "He had the right attitude. He chewed gum, looked arrogant, and flipped the bird to the guards. He did everything the prisoners wanted to do." Inspired by Cash's performance, Haggard decided to pursue music after his release, eventually becoming one of country music's greatest stars. Cash also formed a bond with James Whitmore, a Folsom inmate who wrote to Cash regularly after the concert. Their correspondence revealed Cash's genuine interest in the lives of these men beyond just performing for them. In one letter, Cash wrote to Whitmore, "Your letters mean more to me than you know. They remind me why I came to Folsom in the first place. Not just to revive my career, but to shine a light on the humanity that exists behind these walls." What made these connections so powerful was Cash's refusal to judge. He never asked inmates what crimes they had committed. To him, they were men who had made mistakes, just as he had, and deserved to be treated with dignity. This perspective was revolutionary in the late 1960s, when tough-on-crime rhetoric dominated American politics. By humanizing prisoners through his music and personal relationships, Cash challenged the public to see beyond the crimes to the human beings serving time. These personal connections transformed Cash's relationship with prisons, both from a performer to an advocate. He began to use his celebrity status to fight for concrete changes in America's criminal justice system, a fight that would continue for the rest of his life. What many fans don't realize is that Johnny Cash's involvement with prison reform went far beyond recording two famous live albums. In the years following his prison concerts, Cash leveraged his fame to become one of America's most prominent advocates for criminal justice reform. In 1972, Cash was invited to testify before the United States Senate Judiciary Committee's subcommittee on prison reform. Sitting before some of the most powerful politicians in America, Cash spoke not as a celebrity, but as someone who had witnessed the reality of prison conditions firsthand. "I have seen and heard of things at some of the concerts that would chill the blood of the average citizen," Cash told the senators. "But I think I've also seen the need for a lot of reform in the prison system. I don't see any solution as long as we try to rehabilitate these people in cages." This wasn't just talk. Cash put his money and reputation on the line, funding prison reform initiatives and rehabilitation programs across the country. He established the Johnny Cash Foundation for the Rehabilitation of Prisoners, which provided financial support for programs teaching inmates job skills they could use after release. Cash also used his television platform to bring prison issues into American living rooms. On his ABC variety show, The Johnny Cash Show, he frequently featured former inmates who had successfully rehabilitated, giving them a national platform to tell their stories. This was revolutionary television in the early 1970s, when most Americans preferred to ignore the realities of incarceration. One of Cash's most significant contributions was his work with Billy Graham to produce the film Riding the Rails, which was shown in prisons nationwide. The film addressed the challenges of reintegration after release and offered practical guidance for inmates preparing to return to society. Cash's advocacy wasn't always popular. He received death threats from people who viewed him as sympathetic to criminals. Radio stations occasionally refused to play his music. Even some of his fellow country artists distanced themselves from his prison reform work, fearing it might alienate conservative fans. But Cash remained undeterred. When asked why he continued to fight for prison reform despite the backlash, he simply said, "Those are human beings in there, with souls. Just because they've made mistakes doesn't mean they should be thrown away." Perhaps most remarkably, Cash continued performing in prisons long after the famous albums had been recorded and his career had been revitalized. Between 1968 and 1986, he performed in over 30 different correctional facilities, often at his own expense and with no recording equipment present. For Cash, these weren't publicity stunts. They were a mission. By the end of his life, Cash had transformed from a musician who sang about prison to a genuine advocate who had made tangible improvements in the lives of incarcerated Americans. His legacy extends far beyond the famous recordings at Folsom and San Quentin. It lives on in the reforms he helped inspire and the lives he helped change. Johnny Cash passed away in 2003, but the impact of his prison concerts and advocacy work continues to resonate today. What began as a career-reviving performance became something much more profound, a lifelong commitment to humanizing the incarcerated and fighting for a more just system. The legacy of Cash's prison concerts can be measured in several ways. Musically, at Folsom Prison and at San Quentin remain masterpieces that captured Cash at his most authentic and powerful. They revolutionized the concept of live albums and influenced countless artists across multiple genres. Bruce Springsteen once said, "The first time I heard at Folsom Prison, it felt like a punch to the gut. That's when I understood music could be about something real." But the true legacy goes beyond the music. Cash helped change public perception of prisoners at a time when tough-on-crime policies were gaining momentum. By showing the humanity of the incarcerated, he challenged Americans to consider whether our prison system was truly serving its purpose. Many of the reforms Cash advocated for, education programs for inmates, mental health services, rehabilitation instead of pure punishment, have gradually become part of mainstream criminal justice reform discussions. When Cash first spoke about these issues in the early 1970s, he was considered radical. Today, many of his ideas are embraced across the political spectrum. Perhaps most importantly, Cash demonstrated the power of genuine empathy. He didn't perform at Folsom and San Quentin as a tourist or an entertainer looking down at his audience. He performed as someone who recognized his own flaws and struggles in the faces looking back at him. As he wrote in his autobiography, "They were the forgotten, just like I had been forgotten. But for the grace of God, I would have been right there with them." The Man in Black's willingness to stand with the marginalized wasn't just a fashion choice or a marketing strategy. It was the core of who he was. When he sang, "I wear the black for the poor and the beaten down, living in the hopeless, hungry side of town," he wasn't just writing lyrics, he was describing his mission. Johnny Cash's prison concerts remind us that true artistry isn't just about entertainment, it's about truth-telling, even when that truth is uncomfortable. It's about using your platform to amplify voices that might otherwise go unheard. And sometimes, it's about walking into a dangerous place surrounded by society's outcasts and saying, simply and powerfully, "Hello, I'm Johnny Cash."